Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
We're going to wait a few more minutes to have maybe an opportunity for others to join us, and then we'll get into the programming.
Well, thank you.
I think I'm going to get started. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. I think I'm really excited about today's programming. I've been wanting to share the story and invite Ted Lott from Lot 3 Mets to join and talk about critical infrastructure for a time. I'm really excited about this principle. I think design for discovery is honestly, it's one of my favorite principles because it's all about iteration. What we're learning from our profession, what we're learning about the interventions we have and make in the design process, learning and constantly improving. So I just am really thrilled for this program and for this case study to share with you all. So before we kind of get into it, I wanted to take a moment to thank our sponsors, right? So AIA Grand Rapids helps us out and gives us some space and time to put these events and programming together, and we couldn't do that without our sponsors. So we just want to take a moment to thank them. And then dive into a little bit of an agenda. I'm not an overly formal guy, but find that agendas help me keep me on track. So first and foremost, we're just kind of do again, reintroduction of the framework for design excellence. I think you'll probably, if you've been on past programming, you'll maybe be bored with this, but it's a kind of a new way of thinking about, the practice and how to ask prompts and questions in the design space. So, and it's a relatively new tool and it's constantly updating. So I just wanted to make sure we kind of start each one of these with just an introduction to it again, if you haven't been familiar with it. And then I'm going to go over a quick overview of the design for discovery. So framework toolkit information that's available on the website. And then I'm going to invite Ted to kind of speak to his case study, critical infrastructure. And then after both of those, what we'll have is about 40 minutes of a Q&A. And that's my favorite part. So really looking forward to kind of getting into the questions with you all. Before I begin, it looks like everybody's muted, but as you kind of come on, make sure you mute yourselves. And um, towards the end, when we go into our breakout sessions, I'm going to ask you to turn on your camera. So just be forewarned for that. Um, kind of getting into the framework for design excellence, as I mentioned, it's a tool AIA National has put together. There's 10 principles. And what happens if you kind of Google the framework for design excellence? It's a web-based tool. There is a PDF, but I don't find it's very helpful, simply because it's a static thing, and what happens on the website is as new information is developed, it gets populated there. So I just really recommend you all to kind of just find the framework for design excellence on the website, and what you'll see is if you click on that tool to the right, that framework for design excellence download, that's the PDF. But if you keep scrolling down, you'll see this matrix, and it has all the 10 principles listed. Last month we did design for integration. We had a team from Integrated talk about the Highlands project. We're kind of doing this out of order, and maybe it's wisdom, maybe it's folly, I'm not entirely sure yet, but we're going to skip to all the way to the end for this one and talk about design for discovery. So last month it was design for integration. That was really all about early phase kind of thinking and thoughts and how to build a team and the integrative design process. Really front-loaded efforts in thinking through early phase stuff. Design for discovery is really the other, on the opposite end. It's what we learned after the fact. It's post-occupancy surveys. It's thinking through, it's walking through the built product that we've designed, asking ourselves and probing and finding for ways that we can improve. So I think it's actually, it works well that they're programmatically paired like they are. But in the framework, you'll find that the design for integration is first and design for discovery is last. But just so happens we're pairing them in this way. But just to kind of give you some context, the idea here is this is really post, the project's done. What are we learning from it? How can we improve? And so that's kind of the mentality that goes into you. So if you click in design for discovery, which is now the kind of overview of that particular principle. So we click in design for discovery and you're kind of led into these focus topics. And if you're reading the framework is really these questions, these prompts, right? So if you click that PDF I mentioned earlier and you open it up and you kind of scroll down to design for discovery, these are the prompts that are included in that framework. And I think how they are been designed to be used is to, as designers, we're thinking, we want you all to kind of look through these prompts and ask yourselves these questions, both at the beginning and at the end, and maybe compare answers, right? But the three that they have to really kind of spark some dialogue or some thinking around how we can, in fact, design for discovery, are what's identified there is like, how can the design process foster a long-term relationship between designers, users, and operators, right? And it's really to think about connecting the design decisions that are made in the process with how the building actually gets used and operated in after the fact, after the designers and architects are long gone. How our performance data and experiential stories shared. I think the last part of that I think is critically important, right? Not only the good case studies, but what are the bad case studies, right? What's the critical conversation we want to have about the decisions we made, good or bad? And the first kind of statement there, the performance data. What I like about that is it's not talking about energy, it's not talking about water. Performance in my mind and how I think about it in practice, it's really generic, and it can and ought to be defined by the project team. So buildings can perform in a myriad of different ways, right? And it's really important to ask yourself the question about how the thing can be performing to begin with, so that when you get to the end, you have metrics to compare to, right? So I think that's a really critical question to ask, as we kind of get into the design process. And then also, like I said before, once we're all done, revisit those questions and see how they answer after we've had a chance to kind of get into the space that we've designed. And then lastly, like what strategies promote a sense of discovery and delight, right? I think far too often we get bogged down into the practicalities of the profession, right? Especially in my space, a sustainable design consultant, right? Like it's really easy to just kind of get wrapped up into the details, the checklist, the prescriptive things that we ought to do, code implications, all of that. But what happens if we step back and ask ourselves about delight and well-being and in this idea of discovery? And I really have to say here, this is why I'm really happy and pleased to have Ted with us today, because I think his project that he's going to share, I've only been kind of tertiary observing it just because of my connections and living in Grand Rapids, right? But just from that perspective, it's been delightful to see how this project has unfolded. And I think it's a tremendous case study for this specific thing. So again, I'm just really thrilled that Ted's going to share that with us in a minute. But again, from a framework perspective, these are the prompts that are included in the framework. And if you were with us last time as well, the kind of slides that follow, I don't know why they do this, and I kind of begrudge this to AIA National, right? So they have the framework for design excellence, and then they have the toolkit. And the toolkit is really like the technical resources to help support the framework. But if you go to the website, the two are one, and they're not really differentiated in any way. But what you're seeing really now is a toolkit to help teams think through those prompts in a thoughtful way. And how it's organized. So if you go to the website, right, you click Design for Discovery, you go to that first landing page, which is this guy. It has some focus topics and it has the prompts. You scroll down and you'll see this bar at the top, right? Best practices, high impact, resources, and projects. And that's just really, again, like a data or a collection of resources to help teams understand and unpack some of those prompts and unpack why we're talking about it and thinking about it. I'm not going to read through it all. It's just a resource for you all to be familiar with. I did want to just take a quick moment to walk through some of them. So again, design for discovery is really about, it's about thinking about post-occupancy early in the design phase, and then revisiting that after you're done, the building's built, people are in it. And then it's about learning from what that whole process taught you. And so part of that is just collecting data. And this one has to deal with post-occupancy engagement. So I think in my experience, most designers, most architects, when they're done, design drawings are complete, they go through a lengthy construction administrative phase, right? They're answering lots of questions in the field, they're arguing with contractors, they're over budget. They're ready to be done with their projects when the grand opening arrives. If we're really honest with ourselves, we're done. And we're not about to continue to just because of the emotional energy and the taxing process, right? But I think it's a missed opportunity to not revisit that project and not engage with its users, not engage with the client afterwards. And this really is just all about really encouraging designers and architects and practitioners to ask thoughtful questions once the building is done of the users, of the client, without fear of granted, you probably want to have a good relationship with the client, right? You don't want to burn that bridge before you get to this point, but assuming you've survived the project and you have a good relationship with this client, it's really important to kind of come in there and ask intelligent questions, getting some frank and honest feedback. What I also want to say here is, I don't know if one of the things I want to say in my space, like the integrated design process is great about setting up shared, cultivating buy-in about shared goals and shared visions for the project, right? And what happens oftentimes is you have a project goal that you have, but you have no way of measuring if you're successful, right? A great example of this is relatively recently, one of the projects that I was a part of, one of the key performance indicators or one of the goals was happy employees, right? We want happy employees. Well, how do you measure that? Well, happy employees make fewer mistakes. Happy employees probably stay with us longer than, so we maybe have less attrition. Happy employees are probably more profitable. So do you have any metrics that you can use to track that? No, don't. So they're trying to, like, where I'm going with this is the integrated design process is a good tee up for design discovery because it identifies the metrics that you may want to encourage your clients or you yourself to measure and track from the beginning, so that when you get to the end, you have the infrastructure to ask the questions, to engage with this information, right? Post-occupancy engagement is a good example of that. Like, um, I was on a phone call with the Henry Ford healthcare facility group the other day, and we were talking about the connections between kind of biophilic design and productivity, right? And so I was, okay, that's great. Let's measure how successful we are in biophilic design with your productivity. But they didn't have any metric to really gauge that, right? So it was a moment to say, okay, let's see if we can try to get at that metric so that we can measure if we were successful after the fact, right? It's thinking about the goal at the beginning so that when we get to the end, we can actually have some baseline to compare it to, right? So again, I think that's just a great framework and think about, like, what questions we can ask of ourselves so that when we get to the end, we can actually have data and information to collect and compare against. This, I think, is, I'm not going to go into detail all of these simply because time, but this is really about just making sure there's a connection between the work that we're doing and the people that are operating and maintaining the building. Knowledge sharing and lessons learned. I think this is kind of what we're all about here at Local Committee on the Environment, right? This is what this program is about, kind of sharing stories and case studies and what worked well and what didn't work well, with not just the project team, but with the general public, with the professional membership of AIA Grand Rapids. So I think that's a critical element to not only just keep that information to yourself, right, but to help the whole profession improve. Um, you know, this last one is interesting, and I think it's interesting because there's a I think there's a gap in the marketplace of understanding how architecture influences behavior. And again, I'm going to foreshadow Ted's project here. I think that's a great case study. What he's going to share is a great case study to kind of reinforce this idea that the built environments have a tremendous impact on how humans behave within it. And having that conversation with clients, what kind of behaviors they want to encourage or discourage, right, ought to be part of the design process. So again, back to so that was the best practice section of the toolkit. Now we're on to the high impact. So basically this is a summary. So if you're going to do a few things, what would they be? I didn't come up with this list. This is just the list that's there. I have some thoughts on where it misses the mark a little bit, but the three things they say, just if you can't do anything, talk about energy use intensity, ask for utility bills to see how your building's energy performance is compared to what you predicted it would be a really good kind of thing to do. But it kind of minimizes this design discovery to an energy conversation. I think that's a little bit misleading. I think the second one is spot on. Don't be afraid to engage the owner in honest feedback about the process, the project, what worked well, what didn't work well, and share those lessons. And that's the third one. So I think that's great. Resources, that has a list of resources here, has templates for post-occupancy evaluations. And I think these are great. And there's a big disclaimer that they have on the website that I didn't include because I don't agree with it. Maybe I'll get in trouble. I don't know. But I'm going to go ahead and just say one of the things that I want to add to this list, there's a few things that I think provide a tremendous resource to help think about collecting post-occupancy information. they're aligned with third-party vendors, and that was what the disclaimer was. I'm not advocating for any particular product. I'm just saying that there are tools in the marketplace that exist for the specific purpose of helping understand how successful project teams were in predicting their performance and measuring the impact of their contributions. ARC is a great one. It's full of a lot of great data, and it's easy. It integrates with Energy Star Portfolio Manager. It provides templates for designers to engage with building users. It has templates for surveys that directly is incorporated into the platform, and you can track across multiple years, multiple projects. So it's just a great platform to kind of think about collecting data across multiple projects. I have these up here, not because I think every project needs to be well certified or any sort of certification, but they're here because they're both performance-based standards. And performance-based standards are a great way to think about design discovery because they require teams to measure after the fact, and they require teams to be accountable to that. And so I would just encourage you all, if you haven't read through some of those products or you haven't been a part of a project, to just think through what it means to be as a profession. And this is just really a question, what it means for the profession to be accountable for the decisions that we make. And performance-driven or performance-based standards such as WELL and such as Living Building Challenge are a great way to think through, and connect accountability, I guess, to the profession, because we're all making design decisions. And if we're not capturing the data and how they impact users and people after the fact, I think we're missing a tremendous opportunity. I think with all that said, I'm going to tee it up to Ted, and he's going to kind of go through his project, and yeah, and then we're going to have a Q&A afterwards. So kind of with that said, I'm going to welcome Ted to talk about critical infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Van Sweden. Can I share my screen? And I want to share this one here. And hopefully everybody can see that. Thanks everybody for hanging out today and listening to this a little bit. This is ostensibly about the installation we did for Project One, but it's also about kind of how we got to Project One, the projects we did beforehand that weren't Project One. Come on. Okay, so can everybody hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Ted.
Okay, good. Just I always struggle when I don't have hecklers in front of me. Don't know which way I'm going with some of this. So anyways, what we were talking about for Project One is ultimately access as art, or in addition, art as access. So as an introduction, or as a refresher on this, I'd like to show you a quick video.
I'm Paul Amenta. I'm the founder of SiteLab and an artist.
I'm Ted Lott. I'm an architect here in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and I like to build stuff.
Well, probably the simplest way to describe it is we're creating an accessible pavilion of sorts. It's a bit of a theater. It's a music venue. It's a gathering space. What we were hoping to accomplish with it was to essentially create an infrastructure, a platform of sorts for the community to then take over.
Yeah, I think what we're doing is we're creating a frame for other collaborators to be able to express themselves. And the hope is that we can create a frame that transcends a little bit of the sticks and the metal that we're putting together.
Build this thing, get it started, and then walk away and say, now it's yours, and do with it what you want, add on to it, tear it down, whatever. The project sort of is successful based on their participation at the site. We're just sort of getting it started, right? We're sort of building out the space, this accessible space, and we're asking people to come in and use it and abuse it however they wish.
And that also goes back to the ideas that Dissart is bringing to the table about people being able to appreciate the work in different ways and making them able to do that.
I'm Jill Vinn, and I'm co-founder and co-director of Dissart with Chris. Expressions of disability, cultural identity help us to increase the awareness, understanding, and belonging of people with disabilities so that we can create a community where all people participate.
Over the years, we've been really fortunate to collaborate with artists and universities and galleries and folks who are interested in helping reformulate what it means to be disabled. And I think people expect access to be about ramps and elevators. And in some ways, that will always be the case because we do need to make sure that our physical built environment is accessible. But what we're trying to talk about is a larger sort of cultural access, which is all about empowerment and about flourishing. So how do you flourish as a society? We believe that you flourish as a society when you give everybody a chance to be part of it.
So the critical infrastructure story is the latest in a series of collaborations between Paul Amenta and I that began in 2016 with an installation at Site Lab's Rumsey Street project. The initial idea for that was to connect 3 buildings in various states of disrepair to allow for the display of the buildings from new vantage points and also to provide access to above grade galleries. But primarily it was intended as a work of art. When Paul and I came together to talk about these things, we ended up coming at it from 2 very different perspectives, but similar perspectives. Paul's reference point was Gordon Matta Clark and his concepts of building cuts. And that's really what kind of inspired him in this work. And I came at it from a different place, but with the reference point of Christo and Jean-Claude, and they're thinking about process art or process as art. And it's always something that we talk about at La 3 Metz as to how the process contributes, just the effort of getting it done, what that really does to the final work, how it changes it, how it morphs the project as you go along. This is an early sketch of what we ended up calling hybrid structures, and I show this primarily to make the comment that nothing that we've ever drawn or conceived has been built the way we thought it would. All of this work changes as we go to adapt to the site, time we have to build it, abilities of the people building the work. We're oftentimes building this with volunteers, and so there's not really any opportunities for things beyond common ideas and common building types. And then just basically trying to guess like how much more work we have before we're going to run out of money. So when you look at the final, when you look at work, you'll see lots of things here that that weren't the way we drew them to begin with. And ultimately what this, as an architect, what this reinforces to me is that there's nothing sacred in a process like this. Nothing is precious other than kind of the service of the core idea and the idea that we have to finish this somehow and we have to open and people have to be able to experience it. And in this case, occupy it. So we get it done and we get it open, and then the unexpected happened. People saw the work and got on the work and walked around on the work and ended up getting excited themselves about how they could use it for their own performance, party, or exhibit. And we were we were amazed. It was like, cool, let's do that. We hadn't thought about it. So what should we do? So DISARC came to us and said, we'd like to do a fashion show on it. And they've done these fashion shows previously in other venues, much more traditional venues and much more shows. But we were really excited. It's like, yeah, let's do a fashion show. So on a night in September, and if you look over on the left, you can see my big head and my mother standing next to me as we got ready to watch that fashion show on our installation in 2016. A surprisingly large production and 2,500 people to view it, which was, again, something that we had no idea was going to happen. So here is another little video here from the evening that gives you a flavor about what happened. The next two installations we did in the series were done in 2016 and 2017 for the Untitled Art Fair in Miami. There, in 2016, during the installation of the piece you see on the slide, Wynwood Radio walked up to us and said, "That's pretty cool. What do you think we could broadcast our radio from up at the top of that?" And we said, similar to the last time, we said, yeah, hell yeah, that's a great idea. Why don't you guys get your stuff up there? And we figured out a way to get all their broadcast equipment up on top of our little tower that we were designing. And they spent the art fair up there doing interviews with artists and doing their production. They enjoyed it so much that they invited us back the next year, and the installation we did for them in 2017 was specifically for Wynwood Radio. It was for them, and they again spent the whole time broadcasting from that installation. Additionally, in 2017, during Sitelab's time at Old Christian High during Art Prize, we collaborated with Ebony Road Players on a production of Detroit 67. This was found object set design while turning a disused space into a theater. It was relatively simple and inexpensive, but we had committed partners. And I think it served to broaden our thinking about collaborators and the kinds of expression we could support in these kind of found spaces that we were working in. So we jump ahead to 2019, and Paul calls me and says, we need to go find a site. And so Paul and I went out looking for sites. And one of the things I think that's really cool about Site Lab and Paul is their instincts. They are by nature, they're hermit crabs. They'll go and inhabit a shell for a while, and then when they outgrow it, or when the shell doesn't work for them anymore, or when the shell isn't available to them anymore, they'll move on to the next shell. And I think it's great how that they're always interested in a rugged context to inspire their work. And I think that's one reason why we get along really well. We share those values. The Site Lab and Lot 3 Metz shares those values. And as active participants in our community, Greg Metz and I always pride ourselves on knowing the little corners and opportunities that may be available for a project or a building or an opportunity. We've always got a couple stuck away, ready to use. And after some investigation, we focused on the old Tanglefoot flypaper factory, which you see just southwest of downtown Grand Rapids. Here's the site, very much as we found it in January 2019, with probably, there was probably more snow on the ground when we found it the first time. And from our discussion in the video, we decided we were gonna create a performance space that would be as flexible and as accessible for as many different abilities and expressions as possible. But how do we do that? And what does that really mean? From site confirmation, from the day that we got the owner to say it was okay, to the day that we were opening, we had 6 months to figure it out. In that kind of time frame, design decisions have to be instinctive, fast, achievable, and ultimately good. And then when they don't work, we have to be flexible enough to find the next best idea. The space itself turns out to be roughly a traditional shoebox theater shape. And while we wanted to make sure there was a focal point for a performance location, a stage for, using the common vernacular, we also wanted to make sure that the space would support performances in a variety of locations. The idea is that you could perform from anywhere and observe from anywhere, and the performers could be of any ability and the observers could be from any ability. So to me, this is also a lesson in context. The space itself was telling us what it wanted to be. It was a shoebox theater shape. At that point, we have to listen and decide whether we're going to disregard that information or not. I think in cases, either response is valid, but in the case where you have a limited amount of time and a limited budget, rarely does it make sense to turn away from the obvious solutions. So we need to be intentional about how we address the suggestions the space is making us. So to antecedent performance spaces, there were a number, but to me, this was one of the most influential. This is the Pop-Up Globe Theater in a parking lot in New Zealand. It's a theater in the round with a thrust stage. It's temporary architecture. It's not precious. It's not there forever. It's scaffolding, plywood, and it's literally wrapped in plastic, sitting in a parking lot. And so ultimately, I wasn't concerned about how the place would work and feel when it was full. I felt like a good Site Lab party would take care of itself. I was much more concerned with how it would work and feel when it was almost empty. There were events and performances scheduled 4 days a week for 6 weeks, and not all of those events were going to be well attended. So here's a sketch about the plan that's very close to to how it was built. And we ended up with a thrust stage along the long wall, very similar to the Pop-Up Globe, with the primary audience spaces wrapping around it. It's also, after a fact, very much like the Metro in Chicago, ultimately, if you've ever been to a show there. And with this early sketch, again, this is not something that was built, but the idea is that we wanted to get as many people as close to the stage as possible, and to get people up over the stage as much as possible. That verticality being kind of the magic in that space, and getting people up there, especially if they're not used to being up high in open spaces, is a little bit of the magic we were trying to get to. So ultimately, we ended up with 1 month of construction time with volunteers and contractors. Again, construction methods had to be common and simple to ensure that a variety of skill levels could step in and contribute. And this is a project where we were fortunate enough to be commissioned. So we had money to pay for, professional contractors to build it and to hoist things into place and to pour concrete that was, going to slope water where it needed to go and things like that. But there were still lots of things that volunteers had to step in and help with on this project. So here's the finished work, literally hours before the opening party with the stage on the left. And as we talked about, a variety of vantage points, a variety of access points, and a variety of performance points. From hybrid structures to critical infrastructure, we've gone from a very specific work, a very specific conceived of artwork, to a much more ambiguous built landscape. And I think what has happened here unintentionally, and this wasn't something that we talked about, but that the more we've attempted to accommodate people and uses that are beyond our kind of immediate understanding or beyond the way that we work and think and function, the looser the spaces have become. The more open the design has become, the more ambiguous the design has become. And I think this idea of kind of even allowing looser spaces is not something that comes easy to architects or artists. And it's been one of the things that for me has been educational in this, about how it's important for me to, as a designer, to somehow, and sometimes, and it's more times than I would think about previously, to step away from the design, to understand when you've done enough and when you're about to do too much. Here's a picture from opening night at the back of the stage. That was a really fun party. And this pic, I didn't know this pic was taken until much later. And it's a very important picture to me. And it's essentially about in the video, which was taken well before this picture was taken, where I said I wanted to try to transcend the sticks in the metal that we were putting into this installation. This is Chris and I at the opening party having a conversation eye to eye. And that's something that, from his perspective, is very, very rare. And Chris's observation during the time that this project was open was that this was the only space that he had been into in his life that he was able to watch a performance from anywhere he chose. There wasn't a specific handicapped area that he had to get to. He could pick any place in that venue to watch the show from, and he could change his point of view at any time during the performance and go someplace else to get a vantage point. To me, this is when we're most successful as designers, when people are able to attach meaning or memories or emotion to work that's beyond what we have considered in the work. And I think that's kind of when we're really fortunate and when it's the best work. I spent a lot of time talking to Chris about his work and our work, and there's no way I could have designed this moment, but we were able to create a frame for this to happen. Here's our current poet laureate from the city of Grand Rapids, Kid Kane, during a performance. This is Cabildo on one of the last nights at the end of October. It was really cold. We were able to have an opera as a performance that incorporated music and projections into the performance. It was one of those times where the space really sang with the performance. And this is my favorite pictures from the opening night party as well. So again, this is our attempt at access as art. And I don't ever want to talk about projects like this with acknowledging the dozens of contributors. This is truly process art. There's folks here that are listed here that this could not have happened without their input. Even as far away as our friends at the city of Grand Rapids who were willing to take leaps of faith with us from a building code standpoint and from a performance standpoint to allow for things like this to happen. And then the typical, there's corporate sponsors as well that went beyond the Project One support for this project as well. And thanks to all of them for their monetary and in-kind donations on the project. So in the end, these are all temporary projects that have ended up being kind of study models for the next one in the series. And each one has informed the next as we've gone through. And to me, these are exercises in ownership and permanence or lack thereof. And understanding that when a project is temporary, which is, as architects, is not something we experience very often, how does that temporary nature of the project affect the design and affect the decisions we're making as part of the project? We're really fortunate, not just me, but our work at Lot 3 Metz has been hugely informed by being able to kind of moonlight and play in these environments. We've been really fortunate to be able to learn from Paul Amenta, from Site Lab, from DisArt about how our work affects people in the built environment. That's everything I wanted to talk to you about as far as the presentation goes. I wanted to make sure that I was valuing everybody's time and not going over. But I'd be very happy to take questions at this time. I hope everybody could hear all that, and it went pretty well from a technology standpoint.
I just have to say, Ted, you know, when you and I have been talking about this program and this event and you sharing your story, I was honestly surprised Design for Discovery was the principle that you elected to choose. But I think the story you had with you and Chris seeing eye to eye, right? Like, and him saying that's the first venue, that's the first show he's been at where he could go anywhere and see it from wherever he wanted, wherever he chose. I think that was just a really, really beautiful story about how, because it didn't just happen by accident, right? You've been at this work for a long time. You learned things from the first project all the way through all the different iterations to this critical infrastructure project. I just thought that was a really, really succinct narrative about the value of thinking through this and applying lessons learned and constantly improving. Because then you almost, and you kind of said this, you arrived at that almost by accident, right? You didn't design that moment. That was just achieved through the hard work that went into all the critical thinking that went into it, right? And I just want to kind of acknowledge just how beautiful that story was.
Well, that's cool, man. Thank you.
Does anybody have any specific questions for Ted? Because the next thing on the agenda is to actually do a Q&A where we're going to do a, what I call 1-3 all. And it will kind of talk, what I want you to have is kind of gather your thoughts about the whole program. But if we have specific questions for Ted, now is a good time to kind of air them or ask them, and then we can move on to the next item in the agenda.
Happy to share some of those pictures again, if you'd like as well. I see a question in the chat. Should I just answer that, Matt?
Yep.
So an example, asking for an example of a decision that I made that has a different outcome due to the fact that it's not a permanent structure. And that's a really good question on this one. But I think it's more of a feeling or an approach than it is a specific decision. Because what it ultimately does for me as a designer is it goes back to that idea of preciousness and that idea of like permanence in the, because I know that thing's only going to be used for 6 weeks or a month or whatever it is, we're kind of freed from the permanence of the mistake is really what it comes down to. So we're able to take some chances. We're able to maybe do some things that, it'll be fine. because we know it's only going to be around for a few weeks. And that's, you know, I think that on one side of the coin, you could call that lazy, but on another side of the coin, it enables us to focus on the important things, I think, in the project. And so me, it's much more of the ability to be doing kind of an idea triage or a problem solving triage in the project, where we can spend time on the things that are meaningful and not worry so much about every little detail, because we know that some of this stuff just isn't going to be around. So I feel like that's kind of a cop-out answer, but I also feel like that's how we address it, that we're able to kind of step back and just let some things go past us. And that to me is one of the bigger lessons in this, that we're not chasing every rabbit. We're not chasing every idea. We're not chasing every thought that comes to our mind in this project, because we're not able to, for a lot of reasons. And that discipline, or being able to do that, or being able to flex those muscles or use those muscles frequently, I think helps inform better decision-making all the time. So that's probably not the answer that she was looking for, but that's the answer I'm giving.
Ted, I have a question. First, I want to thank you very much for this presentation. I really admire this work, and I've been watching it over the last few years, and it's cool to see the videos and to hear your story. You know, I guess one of the things that I think comes into play with these kind of temporary urban interventions is, you know, you gather together a certain number of materials, and those materials could potentially be reused for future projects, or they're sort of flexible material systems. And so I wonder, like, to what extent one project leads to the next in terms of material reuse, or, you know, what do you do with the stuff when you're done, and that whole question.
Well, that's different every time, to be 100% honest. But the first one, the critical infrastructure on Rumsey Street, that was very specific. Everything that was built during that project, because if you go to that site right now, it's a GRPS high school right now. So that had a date when the bulldozers were coming in, and that thing was coming out. So there was a plan from day one that all of that material was going to be recycled and reused. And so a specific crew came in to do specific demolition of the work that we put in there to take it and use it on other projects. I can't tell you specifically what it was used for, but it was planned very specifically as part of that project. So that's what happened in that particular one. The second two projects that are more specific kind of follies, for lack of a better term, live on. Those are in a warehouse in Grand Rapids, and the second of which we brought out in the fall and put in the Brewery Vivant parking lot in October of 2020 to reuse again. And both of those projects are probably again going to be reused this coming fall for the work for the site lab installation at the Highlands this fall. So we'll be reusing those projects. So that's it's a different way of looking at it, right? Those projects had to be built in Grand Rapids, put on a truck, driven down to Miami, put back together again, taken all back down and driven back up here. So again, the decision-making process for those was very specific about the process by which they got from here to there and back to here again. It had to be all done with bolts. It had to all be done with things that like two dudes could pick up and put together. Even that tower couldn't be done with a hoist or a crane. It needed to all be able to be put together and tilted up into place by a couple of dudes. And ultimately some college volunteers was what did that tall one in Miami. So that very much informed the design decisions about how we did that. So those projects are going to be specifically reused. The last one, critical infrastructure, still exists, but is in a weird kind of limbo because the building owner technically owns the space, and it's kind of a weird situation with him right now. So we don't really know what's going to happen with those, but But the idea always was is that that one, the newest one, could last over seasons. We kind of understood it that you could pop plywood panels off of that if they decay over time and reuse that. And so this latest one was a much more permanent installation conceptually than kind of the other ones. So it remains in place, and you know, we all hope to be able to use it again someday.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yep.
I think I'm going to put a pin on specific questions for Ted now, and I'm going to share my screen and we're going to go through an exercise. It's the same thing. We're going to get it at a different way. So I mentioned the 1-3 all, and what we're going to do is I'm going to give you all just a couple minutes, maybe less, maybe 90 seconds, to just think, reflect on what Ted's story is, what his projects are, the design for discovery principle, you know, how it impacts your work and how it could impact your work. And then I'm gonna kind of break out into 4 groups, essentially. Ideally it's 3 people, but we're gonna elect a facilitator and a scribe. And how we do that is I'm gonna go into the next slide and tell you how we're gonna do that. But in that space, what's gonna happen is the facilitator is gonna just ask everybody to share one question that they may have for the group, or one insight they have for the group. And you kind of go around, and the facilitator's job is to make sure everybody shares at least one thing. Everybody in the breakout group shares at least one thing. The scribe's job is to capture all the information, write it down in a journal or notebook, or type it on your Word document or whatever. Just capture the information. All right. And then once we've done that, we're going to open it back up to everybody. And then the scribe or facilitator, whoever wants to have the unlucky task of reporting out a key insight that that group had with the rest of us. So that's the way we're going to have a little bit of a democratic opportunity to have everybody share something and kind of distill it all into digestible chunks. And then maybe it leads into some questions and dialogue at the very end. That makes sense? So first, we're just going to think about what we heard and how it kind of impacts our work, or how it could impact our work, or questions we may have for Ted. And then we're going to break up into a group via technology. So I'll be doing that. And then we're going to kind of share that with everybody that's still on the call. Thumbs up for we're good. Before we go next, if you're able to, this is the moment where we want you to share your video, because it's way more, it's easier to share when you can see a face. So if you're able and comfortable to, I really encourage you to share your video. And then I'm going to give you 90 seconds. I'm going to set my timer. Just like I said, just think about the content we shared this afternoon. And after the 90 seconds, I'm going to launch you into a breakout room. And you're going to have 3 to 4 people. Now, I'm going to do 2 groups now because there's only 9 of us left. No, that's 3 groups. That works. My math's really good today. It's been a long day. So 3 groups, 3 people in each, and then you're going to kind of share some of your personal reflection to that group, right? I'll get to that later. So just think about what you've heard, and then I'll get the group set up. All right, I'm gonna put you into your breakout rooms now. Remember, we have 2 roles, a facilitator and a scribe. Scribe is taking notes. The facilitator is making sure everybody has some time to share their story. I'm going to give you 3 minutes, so everybody gets a minute to kind of share. So the facilitator's job is to make sure everybody's limited to at least about a minute. And the facilitator in these breakout sessions is the answer to this question. So just think about the most inspiring project you've been a part of the last couple of years. And then you share that in your group, and the persons whose project is the closest to Grand Rapids is a facilitator, and the persons whose project was furthest from Grand Rapids is the scribe. Does that make sense? So when you're in your breakout sessions, you're going to say where your most inspiring project was located, and the person who's closest to Grand Rapids gets to facilitate, make sure everybody has equal airtime. And the person whose project is furthest away is the person who gets to take all the notes. Good? Makes sense? All right. I'm going to give you a few minutes and then go. Welcome back, everyone. It works fairly well in larger groups, and it seems to dwindle as we kind of go through the Q&A. So hopefully everybody had a pleasant experience in that little sojourn of ours. But we ended up with only 2 groups. Hopefully that worked okay. So I'm going to ask who is the facilitator and scribe of group 1.
I don't know which one group 1 was.
Yeah, I think we were group 3.
So Neil, you were group. I think Ted, you were in group 1 with Marie, right?
Okay.
And Mick, Neil, and Tom were in group 3, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
So, who wants to share group 3's?
Well, we had an interesting group because Tung is pretty much retired, so he didn't have any projects, and Mick is in education, so he didn't have any projects. So I'm the facilitator and the scribe.
There you go.
and I think that, you know, the 3 minutes is so short, we barely had time to get started in gelling our thoughts. But Mick had one good observation about the interesting aspect of the architect and the facilitator, the art side, you know, collaborating so closely on trying to create a space, an accessible space. And my question is sort of, now that you've gone through this a number of times, Ted, where do you take it and how do you apply it to your real practice?
Well, I think that gets a little bit to the stuff I was speaking about before we went to the breakout sessions about how we make decisions and what we focus on in projects. I think it's broader than the specific accessibility issues or the cultural issues. It's much more about how we look at design as a process and how we do that kind of triage of ideas. What I find in our practice, and when I'm around looking at
Am I who froze, or is Ted who froze?
I think Ted froze.
I'll send him a chat.
I'm sorry, I think I'm back.
Yeah, we got you.
You
Okay.
are.
That was my technology. I apologize. Been struggling a little bit today. No, what I wanted to say is I think it's much more about an approach to our broader work rather than like a specific thinking about any one idea. It's more what upsets me the most, or what bothers me the most in our work or other people's work, is when I see too many ideas trying to be realized in a single space, and it ends up kind of devaluing all of it, right? And so what this has kind of done is forced me to step back and take less ownership of work in general. And what that has done is it's forced me to focus on what matters. Or the way we talk about it is, what's the big idea? What are the things we're absolutely trying to communicate? What are the things we're absolutely trying to solve? Because we can't solve them all. And that's really what this process has helped me do. It's helped me kind of step back and do a better triage of our ideas as we're moving them forward, advancing them, and as we're presenting them. And I think the other thing kind of peripherally that comes up in this, and this has helped with, it's not really been about that, but it's always about this idea of communicating the ideas as well. And that's not just about talking about them, although it is. It's talking about them before they exist in a manner that communicates them favorably or happily or whatever you want to say. But it's also about communicating them in the built work. And sometimes that's like with critical infrastructure, I think, you don't want to yell about it. You don't want to have it be perceived. You don't want it to be a playground piece of equipment or this thing that screams, I'm accessible. You just want it to be a place that's cool to hang out. And so that's really, I think, the way it's affected our work the most over time.
I have a question. I wasn't in the breakout groups, but to your point, Ted, about the kind of evolving process, and you kind of mentioned earlier in that response, about how things have changed, and it's you kind of taking less ownership of the design simply because you really want to laser focus on the big idea, right? And that's the critical thing. I'm curious how you've collected feedback from that, like, big idea, and how you've evaluated success or failure in that space and over the course of these projects that you've described. Is it just casual conversations? Because I know you have lots of those with the groups, Paul and folks at Disart, right? Or is there something a little bit more tangible that you're looking at too?
Well, the short answer is there isn't data. There's nothing empirical that we're looking at in these situations. But the way I look at it, especially with these things that are much more temporary and much more about enjoyment, right? They're not really existing to do much more than that, other than, express and enjoy. Are people enjoying them, right? I mean, do people have a good time in this space? Do people walk up and ask questions? Are people asking questions of other folks that get transmitted to me that that are carrying enough weight so they're being carried forward to me? So in that respect, in kind of the post-occupancy idea of this, it's absolutely valid. And to me, the post-occupancy success of this is that Disart wants to collaborate again, right? To me, that's the data point, that that folks that we're specifically working with and specifically trying to address concerns, and I really love it when Chris backs off from the idea of ramps, right? And the math of ramps, and say it's about flourishing, right? I mean, to me, that's a really impressive statement and an important statement about how he, as somebody who sees things differently than I do, is stepping back and saying, yeah, we need a ramp, right? But it's not about a ramp. It's about flourishing. It's about our culture, right? And to me, that's hugely inspiring. And that to me says, if we're able to do that, that to me is success, And then the other thing for success for me is that story I told, right? It's the thing I haven't thought of. It's the meaning that somebody else attaches to it that says it's a success to me. One of the jokes we make at the shop is skateboard on it. And so, like, a success metric, when we do a building and we see like skate skids on it, that to me says urban success. So that's a very specific metric that we talk about all the time.
So I have to say, you said one of our jokes at the shop is, and then you cut off for like 30 seconds. So
Oh, shit.
I really want to hear the joke.
So one of the jokes in our shop to measure urban success is, do people want to skateboard on it? If we see a building or an installation or a something with skate skids on it, that to us is a metric of urban success. And we are always excited to see that as architects at Lot 3 Metz Architecture.
I think that's an interesting metric to use, Ted, because I don't know, it just speaks to the humanity of the work in an urban context, right? And I have like this, like the benches that have the little dividers so people can't sleep in them. I'm like, what is that? Like, why are we putting these barriers up for folks that need to rest? You know what I mean? Like, why are we putting all these barriers to prevent people from using something like that's shared, that's theirs, because it's in the public space? And I
Right.
just
So
that's really interesting.
So that's the, I mean, so to me, the skateboarding idea is kind of the jokey flip side of that very serious discussion, right?
Yeah.
You know, we want, and this gets to, again, this gets to permanence and ownership in my mind.
Mhm.
When we put a building in urban space, many more people own it than the person who actually owns it, right? And how is that used? How is that perceived? To me, that's what makes a city. And so that's what kind of distills down into that joke about, if skateboarders want to skate on it, then that's successful.
Yeah. And I think that's I love that. I just have to say, because oftentimes when I'm talking about integrative design process and stakeholder engagement, and it's like, why are we asking people that don't pay for this what their opinions of what this ought to be? So because you have a really narrow idea of ownership right now, and you may own this project for now, but after you're gone, the community that it's in has to own it for the rest of the time, right? And if you don't engage them, you're missing an opportunity to kind of really have a colorful conversation about that. And I think as practitioners and architects, I think in my journey are resistant to kind of push back on that idea simply because I know it's messy, it's not straightforward, and it maybe can get them into trouble. But I don't know, I just think that's a fascinating kind of dialogue, and I'm glad we're having it. Mick, I see you raised your hand. It's very academic of you, and go for it, Mick. I'm calling on you.
Thank you, Matthew. So, you know, this conversation about skateboarders and about sort of, you know, hardware that's added to public space amenities to make it difficult for people experiencing homelessness to sort of spend time in these places. I mean, this is something that comes up in the work of the Urban Collaborative Studio at KCAD. So we've been doing some urban public space studies in the Division Avenue corridor, for example. And one of the things that often comes up in the context of stakeholders, you know, whether it's the city or it's business owners or it's others in the corridor, is this concern that public space amenities attract people experiencing homelessness, and in that way can alienate other members of the community from using these same spaces. And this is a recurrent tension I've been experiencing in this kind of public space work and research. And you know, I guess I just wanted to know if Ted has encountered similar debates and how you have approached it in your own work.
Well, yeah, Mick, I mean, we run into that all the time, and our practice is primarily urban focused. And so mostly everything we do is in the city of Grand Rapids and now in the city of Detroit as well. But you know, there's some conversations that I have stopped having as a practitioner with people, because I think they're bad faith arguments a lot of times. And I think parking is one of those. I mean, I'm not solving parking. I never am, I never will. It's, whatever. We're going to do the best we can, and yeah, whatever, doesn't matter. The idea of public space and how it's used and who it's used by, to me, is just kind of a bad faith argument. We need to be adults in our city and understand that there's a civic life in our city, and we need to interact in adult ways with everybody, right? And so I'm well versed in what you're talking about, but I've just kind of stopped. I'm not going to convince somebody otherwise, right? I'm not going to convince somebody to be okay with somebody that looks or acts or lives differently than them. That's not within my limited powers in this discussion. So I've just kind of tried to, move past the argument and say that it's everybody's space, and you're okay. You're safe. Nobody's getting hurt. It's still safe for you to be.
I'm going to go on a limb and think that he was wrapping up that comment. And I just wanted to say too, like, this kind of goes back to what I was saying, or what I've said before about, the politics of architecture, right? And, oftentimes safety concerns trump some of these things just because.
And that cop out.
Back with us, Ted.
Ted, we lost you. I mean, I think we got where you were going with that. And I found the answer super, super helpful and interesting. But we did lose a few seconds there at the end, but.
Okay, well, that's fine. It was just a rant. I mean, you can find that rant in many bar rooms in town, so it's not. But I think the point is, and this is the point that I try to make to city folks, to peers, to people we're working for, is just get over it. We've got things we should be solving, and if you want to worry about homelessness, there's a policy world to live in to do that, right? But we need to worry about making the best urban space that we can, and that's for as many people as we can, and that's kind of the principle of a lot of the work that we're doing. So
right. And I think the idea that you design spaces to prohibit or like de-incentivize folks experiencing homelessness to exist in is the same mentality that puts up stairs as barriers for people in wheelchairs. It's the same attitude. It's the same idea. It's like, I don't want to have that conversation, so I'm going to design to this because that's something I don't want to deal with. And that continually to do that just puts that conversation in somebody else's lap and somebody else's space. And so it's just like, it's kicking the can down the road. It's not solving any meaningful problems. If you design the space as Ted's suggesting, then it kind of forces the dialogue, right? And that's where I think architecture is politics, right? It is advocacy, because you can make a choice to kind of design to, the safety concerns or whatever, the parking concerns, or you could design as if they weren't a thing, forcing the conversation, right? And that's the power of design in urban spaces. And I think that, I don't know, that's what's really fascinating to me in this conversation specifically, because not only are we doing that, not only is Ted doing that, but he's iterative, right? And he's learning and he's improving, and then it's impacting his work. I think it was you, Neil, like you said, the real work of a lot we met. And I'm thinking like, this in my world is as real as it gets, right? And like, this is his practice. And that's what I kind of like appreciate about Ted, is like, it's not just, you know what I mean? There's not that distinction I don't see in his work. And I don't know, you can speak to that, Ted, if you want, but I don't know.
Well, I mean, the point is valid. I mean, this is at a certain level, this is play, right? but at another level, it's different muscles with different partners, and I think that makes me a better architect and makes our firm a better architecture firm.
Mhm.
You know, we're always concerned about being able to communicate with whoever we're talking to, and we're omnivores out in the world of work. We work for everybody, and so we need to make sure that that we can communicate with everybody. And to me, that's part of this ethic and part of this partnership of, you know, these various partnerships. You know, that you know, there's other things. There's all sorts of other things, and part of it's just my attention span, but other parts of it, I think, I mean, to me, this has been, I'm very fortunate to have been able to be included in this work.
I want to take a minute and say it's 5 minutes to 5, respect everybody's time. I just wanted to, maybe if there's one last question, we can air it, but I did want to just quickly wrap up with just a few things too. So before I do that, again, if there's any last minute, last question or last comment, now's the time for it. All right, well, with that, I just want to thank Ted again. I'm gonna be honest, was hoping for a little bit more participation, but this is what it is, I guess. And I thank everybody that's still on the call for sticking with us and engaging in this really delightful conversation. It was almost accidental that Ted mentioned the Highlands, right? So not only were like the design for integration and design for discovery kind of paired, but we had the Highlands project, and then, you know, Ted's project for infrastructure, which will have some iteration or some next project with Paul and Site Labs crew at the Highlands this fall, right, Ted? This fall. So it's kind of like a serendipitous intersection of lots of things happening. So encourage you to check out Site Lab at Highlands this fall and see what Ted and Paul and his crew are going to come up with. Next month, I don't have a program yet for the next framework principle, but I guess just check your emails as Pam will kind of get that out as it's defined. So again, I just want to take a minute and thank everybody, Ted specifically. Again, really compelling projects and stories, and I just thank you for your time.
Well, thanks for hanging out, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Ted. Good job.
I'm Matt. I'm Ted. Yeah, very good.
Hope to see you all again soon.
Yeah.
Yeah, bye everyone. Yeah.
Bye-bye.